Thank you very much. I'm honoured to be asked to speak to this uniquely wonderful college. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes or so just to explain why I, on leaving school, chose my particular profession, which isn't a very well-chosen one, but nonetheless I did. And then, having done that, I hope to show some pictures of some of the package holidays which I've been doing for about 38 years. When I say we, I'm talking about our group. There's 52 people on our group, most of whom have been with us for 39 years. The only thing which all of them have got in common is that I've never paid anybody anything at any time. So there's no financial involvement, but they are still with us. Obviously, quite a few are dead, so they're not, but the rest. When we count up our failures and successes of breaking world records over that time, about 50% are failures, but we include as failures when we've broken the world record but not actually got to the final goal. If you do get to the final goal, then what we do is to make a lot of noise about it in the media, because that is what our sponsor wants, and to us the sponsor is God. Also, if you get to the pole or whatever, you stick your flag there before anybody else puts their flag in the same place, especially our friends the French. And I would say, if we have been any good at doing this over the years, it is probably due to the selection of the individual people on the team. And I used to keep that to myself. And if I'm looking at somebody maybe to take them on, I don't give them 1 out of 10 on their characteristics or anything complex like that. I only go for their motivation, because how a person is motivated is how they behave for themselves and therefore for their company or their expedition group or whatever. So before an interview, I need a clear definition of motivation. I don't know if you remember a famous Irish psychologist called Anthony Clare was asked to define motivation in a single sentence. He obviously did not do that, because the Irish cannot define anything in a single sentence. But what he did say is that motivation is something which happens to everybody when you are a teenager. You go to school, you meet a professor who one day says something illuminating to you, which sticks in your head and forms the basis of your motivation through life thereafter, which is obviously a load of rubbish. In fact, how you are motivated is the sum total of everything which has happened to you since you were little and how you reacted to it, or possibly even genetic. If you're born stupid, you'll probably stay stupid. If you go to school and you get badly bullied, this is going to have a big effect on how you interact socially for a long time, even if you don't know it. And I think this system of only selecting people on motivation normally works very well, except that, like everything, there are exceptions. And I've been in a hostile area with somebody for 2 months and thought they were brilliant, and then noticed some flaw in their character which could be dangerous later on. And I have to say, in our group, when we notice that sort of thing, what we do is to sack them instantly. None of this sort of sideways British promotional pussyfooting, which just keeps your rotten apples in the barrel. You might think it's all very well for someone like me to talk about sacking, whereas in the real industrial world, of course, you're not allowed to. And in Antarctica, it's even worse. You can sack them, but you can't get rid of them. This means that your selection process has got to be pretty watertight up front. And I think in terms of my own motivation, probably goes way back to when I got born in Windsor, outside the castle, obviously, at a time when it was being bombed during the war, which my mother did not like. So she moved all of my sisters, and me aged 1, out to South Africa for 12 years without consulting us. And I have to say, it was a really nice place to get brought up, except that academically it was way behind the UK. Today it may be the other way around, but that's the way it was. So when we all got back here, my mother had no money. She was looking for somewhere to educate us, and was very happy when she found a place called Winchester College, which took anybody totally free of charge if your family name was Fiennes. This was basically because the bloke that built the college 800 years ago had been called Fiennes and liked the idea of lots of little Fienneses going there free. And also because in those days there were actually very few of us, so it was economically safe for the college. But more recently, we started to breed like rabbits. mostly actors, and it became unsafe for the college. So they changed the rules, and after that, you could only get in free if you got the top level of entrance exam. And due to my African background, I got the bottom level, and they would not accept me, to my mother's disappointment. In fact, the only place which would take people with such a low level of intellect was, of course, Eton College. So I went there for about 5 years, but my level was so low I couldn't even keep up with theirs. But luckily there was boxing, which did not require too much intelligence, and also, of course, stegophily. Stegophily is if you get born with an edifice complex, meaning you like to climb tall edifices at night in order to put things on top to annoy the school authorities. And over those 5 years at Eton, I learnt, I think in the 1960s, British architects stopped using proper steel drain pipes and switched to plastic ones, which very often break when you get up to the 6th floor. So from an academic viewpoint, therefore, Eton was not a total waste of time. But going back to motivation, my mother realized that if I stayed there, I would not be able to do the only thing that I wanted to do with my life since I was little, which was to become the commanding officer of the Royal Scots Greys Cavalry Regiment, which my dad had been commanding when he got killed in the war. In his day, this regiment had 600 grey horses, quite romantic, and also in order to get to be a regular British officer, you did not require to go to Sandhurst to get things called A-levels. But by the time I arrived on the scene, the regiment had switched from horses to tanks, even though it was the British Army, and also you couldn't get to Sandhurst if you didn't have these A-levels. So my mother removed me from Eton because she knew if I stayed there I would not get them. The place is badly designed for getting people A-levels. And I was sent to a famous place in Brighton called Davis's. And if you went there, when you came out the other end, you definitely had your A-levels. And I'm not at all proud of having broken their record. This was not my fault, because that time was the height of the mini-skirt era, and concentration was not therefore possible. So I failed the A-levels twice. But basically, if you cannot get where you want to go, like Sandhurst, you've got to find an alternate route. And I found a place in Aldershot called Mons Cadet School. And if you went there for 5 months and you could prove to the sergeants that under a situation of great stress, you could still dig holes in straight lines, you could become an officer in the British Army. So I did this and I got sent out to Germany. It was the Cold War at that time. And I spent the next 5 years in tanks learning how to retreat from the German border. Did not practice advancing, which got quite boring. So when I saw a notice on the regimental board asking for officers to apply for the SAS, I put my name down, not because I knew anything about the SAS. In those days, nobody had ever heard of them. It was before Harold Wilson started to use them for PR purposes. I had obviously heard of Scandinavian Airlines services, but not the regiment. So I got sent to Hereford, which is where you go to get selected for the unit. And I found there were 190 soldiers trying to get in, 30 other officers. All of them were built like brick houses. Many of them had red berets, ex-paras. None of them came from a cavalry regiment. They called me a donkey walloper. So to be honest, I was quite happy when this lot got ruthlessly eliminated in only 10 days, down to only 3 soldiers and 2 officers. And to my surprise, I was still there. I think probably because they were selecting people from a physical, not intellectual point of view. But unfortunately, on the 11th day, they switched. So I had to try to become alert. And I can remember, if you failed anything, you got thrown out immediately. And what we were having to do, me and the other remaining officer, one particular night, was to cross the local river outside Hereford by night in winter with no clothes on for some military reason. So I woke up extremely tired the following morning at about 11 o'clock. You're meant to get up at 6 o'clock, and I panicked because they leave your instructions every day on your bed. And what it was that particular day was to steal £200,000 from the local bank in Hereford in great detail, which the SAS checked. I had Barclays, the other officer had Lloyd's. So I rushed down to the town, but the bank was already closed, so I could not get in to do a careful burglary plan. So I went around the back and I banged on the back window, and luckily the bank manager came out, charming bloke, very naive, and I explained that I had come from Germany. I was trying to get into the SAS. I had brought all my family silver with me. This bit was not true. He said, no problem, we at Barclays are extremely secure. He showed me all the electronic burglar system, so I thanked him. And in those days, it was carbon paper. I copied the bank raid plan in great detail, one could the SAS just in time, and me and the other bloke had the day off. So we went up to Birmingham, we saw a film and had a spaghetti dinner. And very stupidly after dinner, I left my copy of the bank raid plan in the restaurant. And the manager, later in court, basically gave the plans to the police. There was a ministerial inquiry in Westminster, front page of the Times, why SAS officers were stealing from banks. I was up before the commanding officer, who basically said any more behaviour like this and I would be thrown out of the regiment immediately. Well, for the next year or so, I behaved pretty well in different parts of the world, doing different things. But briefly back here, unfortunately, I got telephoned by an old Eton friend who, by that time, like most of them, had become a wine salesman in the West Country. And during the course of selling his stuff in pubs, he had discovered a village called Castle Combe, which had just been voted Britain's prettiest village by the Americans. And it was being attacked by 20th Century Fox, making a film in this beautiful village called Dr. Dolittle, which involved turning this lovely trout stream, thatched cottages, into a dirty great lake with a concrete dam 20 foot high for filming, ruining the whole village. And my friend decided to bring this outrage to the general attention by blowing up the entire concrete dam the night before the film started. It was a good PR plan. Unfortunately, the police got to hear about it. They put Alsatian dogs all over the dam, but my friend had been at Eton, so he was up to that one. What he did was to rent 8 Alsatian bitches in order to put them upwind of the dam. But at the last minute, the bitches failed to turn up, so he phoned me to ask if I would stand in. Because he knew I had just completed an army explosives course where you learn to blow up as much as you can using as little as possible. And I was pretty good at this, so I had a lot left over at the end of every day. Seemed stupid to give it back to Her Majesty, so I put it in the boot. And 2 months later, the boot was full and sweating, and what better way of getting rid of it than this public-spirited gesture? Unfortunately, everybody was caught. I was not physically caught. I'd been doing another army course on escaping from dogs by night. But they had the car numbers. I ended up in Chippenham prison. I was on police probation for 6 months. I was thrown out of the SAS back to my own regiment, who were still retreating from the German border. I put up with that for about another year, and then I saw a notice on the regimental board asking for officers to apply for the Sultan of Oman's forces. You probably don't remember, but back then world Marxism was doing very well. They just chucked the Brits out of the Yemen and were about to move into the Oman in order to block 80% of the free world's oil coming out of the Gulf. Therefore, the socialist prime minister here agreed to send the Sultan a massive show of military strength, which he did. There were about 9 of us at that time. And I can remember applying to the colonel for the job, but all the other applicants were coming out looking unhappy because they had been turned down due to being too valuable to the regiment. But my application went through immediately. And what the Ministry of Defence think is you cannot command Arabs in the dark being shot at by communists if you cannot speak Arabic. So first of all, you get sent to the best place in the world for learning Arabic, according to the ministry, which is Beaconsfield in North London. I did fail the course, but I was still sent out. And on arrival, you meet your, shall we say, works team for the first time. And these guys were a piratical-looking group. There were 60 of them. Most I discovered were, in fact, Baluchi, so they could only speak Urdu. Many of them were Zanzibaris that spoke only Swahili, and the few that did speak Arabic had not been to Beaconsfield. So we ended with a major communications problem. But I think, going back, it was probably out there, by which time I was a bit old, that I got attracted to travel in very remote parts of the world. This is the navy of the Sultan of Oman, the army. In fact, they were very well disciplined, but like your RAF guys here, except they didn't know left from right, which did make a problem. Also, we had an air force, that is half of the Sultan's air force, photographed, obviously, from the other half. I'm afraid I can't point at the screen, but if you look hard on the right-hand side, that guy is an Omani. Moving in a bit, you've got a Zanzibari. The next one with the machine gun is Urdu. A bit further on, you've got me. All of us were, of course, Muslim. I was Muslim for the 3 years I was out there. You might think that looks like Arabia, which is basically sand, but that is only 99% true, because the other percent was where we were fighting in the war down there. There were 180 of us, all volunteers in the Sultan's army. There were between 3,000 and 4,000 members of the army that we were fighting, the People's Front, very well trained and armed in the Soviet Union in Odessa, and they were at home in the mountains, because where we were fighting, there was a monsoon for 3 months, so it was like Scotland, forest, river, waterfall, and all the rest of it, ideal for them and not for us. So I switched so that I made them not do what they'd always done in their Land Rovers, but stop in the desert, and for the last 20 miles after dark, move into the enemy-held area, which was forest, lay up the ambush positions, never move by day for 3 years, and only in groups of 4 with machine guns and walkie-talkie contact, which was against what they were used to, but you've got to change if you possibly can. No helicopters, so if you got someone badly wounded up in the mountains, it was just too bad. Moving around in the dark, in that area, there were more snakes than anywhere else in the world. And if you get bitten by an Echis carpet viper, you will be brain dead within 2 seconds. And we have the PM, which is even quicker. That is a Soviet anti-personnel mine. Very often, you're sitting on the Yemeni border waiting for the Idarat political execution squads to come over the border to do very nasty things to the Muslim leaders to turn them into Marxists. We were there to stop them coming over the border. But very often you'd be there in a cave waiting above the killing ground for maybe 5 days, which is all the water you can carry, being bitten silly by ticks, and nothing would happen. Could get pretty boring. And I was on leave once in London 2 years later, and I went to the British Museum because no botanist had ever been allowed into this country. There were lizards and things unknown to science. I was trained by the museum and to photograph and to measure them and so on. If you do go to the Natural History Museum, please go to the scorpion department. There is a 28-inch black scorpion with my name in Latin on it. I'm very proud of it. I stroke it when I go there. The chameleon out there grows up to about 23 inches long. You may know if you put them on a green leaf, they go green, but if you put them on a red flower, they will actually turn red. People say if you put them on a tartan blanket, they will explode. The people, and I knew the family of 15 people that lived in that house. Okay, so you might have seen poverty, not this sort of poverty. These people were descended from the Queen of Sheba, who attacked Dhofar in South Oman because it was and is the only country in the world where frankincense trees grow. And in the Roman Empire, that cost a lot more than gold, so it was a good place to attack, which she did at the exact biblical time that Solomon was the king up north in Jerusalem. The trade was huge, but by the time I got there, incense had lost its value and the people were poor. These people were cousins, the Bautachauri, the Makhra, the Shachra, and the Beit Kathiri. They lived in these little tented camps. So imagine you're born and live your life in that house of 3 rooms. Over on the right, you've got a kitchen. In the middle, you've got a sitting room for 15 human beings, garage on the left. And basically, that was it. You live off the camel's milk if it's got grass. If there's no more grass, you've got to put your house on your camel's back, go and find more grass, and that is your life. If you're lucky when you're 12, you might marry someone slightly better off. In our 6 Land Rovers, one of which you might be able to see, We tried to do our best with helping them, but most of our time we were patrolling the great desert, the Saudi, Yemeni, Omani borders with just 6 vehicles. If you went too many times over the same track, they would lay anti-tank mines, which would blow a Land Rover 100 meters and the people inside a lot further than that. So you had to be very careful. I started looking for the lost incense city. If you've read the Bible, you'll know that Sodom, the people got naughty, so God buried them, the city disappeared. In the Quran, you've got Irem al-Adat. That also disappeared, but it is on the first map of the world, which Ptolemy did just after Christ. So I knew that it did exist. And back in 1968, I started my first search for the lost city in the Great Desert. 28 years later, my wife, my late wife Ginny, and I discovered the long lost city, which today is the biggest active excavation works in Arabia. But at that time, I had to leave the Sultan's army, not because I wanted to, I didn't, but because I was thrown out of the British Army because of the previous lack of A-levels. If I'd been to Sandhurst and had a commission, I could have stayed in, got promoted above captain. As it was, 8 years was your lot. So I had to leave. I got married at that time. She also had no money. And basically, the only thing which I could do, which the army had taught me to make a living, was teaching Scottish soldiers in the Cold War in Germany how to ski and climb and canoe in order to stop them beating each other up in the NAFI, which they were doing increasingly because they were bored stiff because the Soviet army never bothered to attack. Now, that was called adventure training and was paid for by the taxpayer. Doing it with my wife, of course, was not, and the new word became sponsorship. In the early days, Ginny and I started looking for the lost city, did many, many other expeditions. Nobody had heard of us, so getting sponsorship was very difficult. At breakfast one morning, that was when she had her bright ideas, she decided what we would do next is the first ever complete journey up the longest river in the world, which is the Nile, 4,000 miles long. And she saw in a magazine that the Guinness Book had just voted the Hover Hawk, that's a 2-seater, as having broken the world record of hovering without a breakdown for 8 hours around a gravel pit in Peterborough. So obviously the right model for the Nile. They had 3 motorbike engines which could lift them 2 centimeters above the surface. We took 8 months to do that, partly because there were a lot of 3-centimeter obstacles. One of the expeditions, quite a lot in those early days, was at the invitation of the British Columbian government. That's Western Canada, Vancouver. They had become a Canadian province 100 years ago. They had been discovered entirely by Scottish explorers who, in this country bigger than 4 Great Britons, but entirely full of deep forest, the only way for the explorers to move was through these great rivers, the roughest rivers in the world, interlocking from north 2,000 miles through the Rockies to the southern border at Vancouver. That year, as part of their centenary, they wanted a Scottish group to try to do the first ever complete river journey all the way from the Yukon 2,000 miles down to the United States border. I was asked to lead it because by then I was on the Army Reserve, and Edinburgh promised that if I did, I would get military support of a Land Rover BER. I later discovered that meant beyond economical repair. They also said that if I went to Edinburgh, I could select out of 600 soldiers the best 3, but when I got there, they'd all been posted to Ireland apart from the cooks, so the choice was not good. But I did find a very fine Scotsman called Joseph Skubinski, and the 3 of them were given a total of 6 weeks annual leave. We took 9 months, so they were not popular when they got back. You might think this was indicative of bad planning, but the ministry, although none of us had been in a rough water or a rubber boat before, only gave us training permission on the Thames at Henley. So when we got to Canada, our learning curve was very steep. The typical rapid, it's called Hell's Gate. You could hear the roar of the rapid from 7 miles upstream. We had 4 boats with 3 people in each boat. On Hell's Gate Rapid, one of them was flipped. We found their bodies a mile downstream. That could have stopped the entire expedition, but luckily it was just the BBC film crew. I can't point at the map because it's behind, I can't even see it, but if you can look at that map, you can see Africa. If you look up at the top, you can see UK. Look very carefully, you can sort of see York. Now, down at the bottom is a white bit, which is called Antarctica. very quickly, round about 1972, everything changed in what we were doing because the media, and our sponsorship depends on media coverage, they were no longer interested in the UK in hot expeditions like what we'd been doing. They only wanted cold polar ones. Now, Ginny and I had by then spent an entire winter in Glasgow, but nonetheless, we obviously had to get acquainted with the cold. She, at breakfast one morning, decided that we, if we're going to get into the polar field, must start ambitiously by doing the first ever journey around the world vertically through both poles, crossing both ice caps and the Northwest Passage and the Sahara and everywhere in between, but that we must not fly 1 meter of the 52,000-mile journey. So at breakfast she suggested it. She sent me to a library to find out the best route. I quickly discovered that the white bed at the bottom had never been crossed from side to side by the world's experts. Up at the top, which you cannot see on that map, there's 2,500 miles of floating sea ice around the North Pole. That had also never been crossed from side to side. So I went home, as you would, and I told my wife that it was a stupid idea. She became quite unpleasant, so I therefore went back to the library. Basically, you have got to be first if you want to get sponsorship. We knew that. We knew the great American polar man, Walt Pedersen, was desperate to be the first human to both poles. He didn't want to go the whole way round like Ginny did, but nonetheless, so we were in a hurry. But if you've got no money whatsoever, you cannot be in a hurry. We wanted an icebreaker, that's £4 million. We wanted a ski plane. We wouldn't fly at all, to drop parachutes off ahead of us in the ice. That cost a lot of money. We wanted, in fact, 1,900 sponsor companies. You need a telephone. Well, the SAS luckily sponsored us with an old derelict rifle range in Sloane Square in London, but it had no telephone. So at night, we put a GPO TA soldier out of the window on the attic, up on the roof, and he fiddled about with the Ministry of Defence phone system, and they sponsored us for 7 years with a free phone. We ended with 1,900 sponsor companies. That's everything you can possibly need. And it took all that time. But we also wanted at least 2 blokes who would be with me doing the 3-year slow move without flying anywhere. I had 800 applicants, people like you who'd be prepared to work for 4 years with no pay. And we got going. Basically, we got down to Antarctica, that welcoming committee down there. That was where the ship, which we eventually got sponsored, arrived on the Greenwich Meridian, which is 0, due south of Greenwich, and there we were unloaded 6,000 boxes, none of which weighed more than 60 pounds, which was what a man can carry in soft snow. And having unloaded, which in itself was a problem, because very often where you unloaded broke up and went out to sea, we said goodbye to the ship. They went round to the Pacific Ocean on the far side of Antarctica, which is bigger than China and India put together, but with no Tesco's en route. This is the problem that we faced. So the ship said goodbye and went round and waited for 18 months for us in case we managed to come out having done the first ever crossing, in which case we'd send a Morse code message. There was no sat-nav, no sat phone, no GPS, no polar satellites, etc. If you wanted to know where you were, you used your watch and the position of the sun, as had been in 1900. Anyway, the ship went round, said goodbye to us. We moved inland through the mountains. We managed to go 400 miles to 10,000 feet above sea level to the last known feature on Earth. If you look, you might not see it, but just beyond our hut on the horizon, you can see the top of a mountain. From that point, for 900 miles to the South Pole, was unknown. It was unmapped. Nobody had been there. There were no satellites. We would be mapping it. We've been trained in Cambridge for the first time, an area bigger than France. But first, we had to sit for 8 months of extreme dark, during which the temperature dropped to minus 122 degrees centigrade wind chill, and when the wind got up to 160 miles an hour. Ginny in Scotland, my wife, my late wife, she designed cardboard houses, which are very light and you can chuck out of a small aeroplane. When we got there, we put them up. They can withstand minus 30 and winds of 40 miles an hour. So you might think that we got cold and got blown over, but actually they're designed so that snow drifts go up to the top of the roof level, giving you insulation and protection, but then, of course, you cannot get out. You might think, well, why would you want to get out? And the answer basically is we were cooking with petrol in a cardboard house. My wife became the world's top polar radio operator without a doubt. Her frequency prediction was better than Marconi's. Her antenna theory was incredible. She could get through to our base in Farnborough when the British Antarctic Survey with their huge antenna couldn't get through to Cambridge. She was amazing. Crossing crevasses, that crevasse had already collapsed, so you can see it. Most of the 15,300-foot deep crevasses on a typical traverse, you can't see them, so you tread on them and fall into them, and then you'll know where they were. Well, that's not very helpful, so we had to practice on one that had already collapsed. 8 months later, after the dark period, the sun came back, and the three of us decided to leave. That mountain, as you can see there, was the last feature on Earth. We said goodbye to the base commander radio operator. That was my wife, Jenny. I gave her that job because it was the nastiest job of all, and the whole thing had been her fault for thinking of it in the first place. But she was not a big person, and she couldn't roll 45-gallon drums around in the snow. Therefore, I had to have a man who was living with my wife for 3 years. So I did not want somebody who was physically attractive in that position. Luckily, we found a Lancashireman for that particular job. We did the first ever crossing of the unknown zone. We mapped it. We used a tent that weighed 120 pounds. Today our tent weighs 3 pounds, but up there you got katabatic winds that go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in under 60 seconds, so you don't have long to fiddle with your tent pegs. So we used the best tent in the world, designed by the world's greatest polar explorer of all time, who today is more lied about than anybody else, a fantastic guy. His expeditions, including when he died down there, produced more scientific information, including Antarctica was a continent, than all the other international polar expeditions of the first half of the 20th century. Amazing guy. We managed to cross the entire continent, the first people to do it. I, as navigator, was very helped because there is only one active volcano, which happened to be where I wanted to go, and I could see the smoke from 300 miles away. When we arrived there, 2 days earlier, the first tourist to Antarctica by air crashed into the volcano. Everybody was killed, no way of removing the bodies. But from the slopes beside it, we could actually see the rest of the journey. Now, that had been planned by Ginny in Sussex off her 6-inch school globe using a crayon about 9.5 years earlier. And I have to say that it was a bit wonky, but basically, if we did get out of Antarctica, we would then send a Morse code message to New Zealand, where the ship had been waiting for 18 months, hoping that they would come through the ice and get to us. If you looked at the newspapers a month ago, you'll see a Chinese icebreaker was stuck in that very place. Our ship managed to get through. They were still on board, still unpaid. 2 were dead, but the rest were okay. Collected us, took us up north for the second part of the journey. If you look at the map, you can see where Australia is. We went from there, that's the Greenwich Meridian, up to Los Angeles, Vancouver, through the Bering Straits. You can just see the top left of the map there. You can just see the tip of Soviet Union and Alaska, that's Canada and all that lot. And 500 miles north of the coast is the North Pole, sitting in the middle of the semi-frozen sea. And that is 2,500 miles that we would eventually have to cross. Now, you might think, because we had an icebreaker, all we would have to do is to go between the Soviet Union and Alaska, that is the Greenwich Meridian, 180 degrees, and just carry on 500 miles to the North Pole, and then go over the other side, down to Greenland and the Greenwich, and back here. But if we went even a little bit in between that gap, Soviet Union, the Bering Straits, you have got 4 million-ton ice floes moving at 4 miles an hour. And if your ship gets between 2 of them, it will actually be sunk. Therefore, when Ginny made the plan 9 years earlier, she decided that the ship would drop the 3 of us in 12-foot rubber boats at the mouth of the Yukon River. Again, if you can see a red line going in to the east from that point, that is the Yukon River. The ship would then disappear around the Panama for a year and wait. We would then try and go 1,000 miles up the Yukon River, 800 miles down the Mackenzie River, and then into the Northwest Passage above the top of Canada, and then 2,000 miles we would switch from rubber boats to a 15-foot open plastic boat and go through the Northwest Passage and then up through the islands for 900 miles, hoping we'd get there before the sea froze at the end of summer. Her plan gave us a total of 2 months to get from the mouth of the Yukon River up to the top of those islands. When we got out there, we found that only 3 expeditions in history had been through the passage bit, never mind the rest of it, and they had taken an average of 3 years to get through. I am not making a comment on female planning, but they do need to be watched. The Yukon River, we had no problem, except that Ollie Shepherd, one of the guys we'd chosen out of 800, had by then spent 9 years on this project unpaid and was threatened with divorce, so he had to leave at this point. We then carried on. If you try to picture this as the bottom of that square, the white square being the top of Canada, the Northwest Passage for 2,000 miles, we had to go left to right, or rather west to east, for 2,000 miles. But 500 miles away, the pole, all that ice is being sent down towards the Canadian coast by the current, and you sometimes can't get through even in midsummer. We were lucky, there was a big storm from the south, blew enough away for 7 days and nights that we could actually get through. But when we reached the far end where you turn north, the sea began to freeze. If you look carefully, you can see it's greasy, that's called grease ice. 2 hours of no wind, it will congeal to sugar porridge ice, at which point the boat will cavitate and it will get frozen in. We later discovered that it remained frozen for 9 years after that. Then Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker managed to rescue it 9 years later. But at that point, the two of us had to cross 400 miles of mountains on skis, which we had not planned to do, and the dark period was coming. Charlie, the other guy, South African, he unfortunately in the boat got soggy feet, and all the skin fell off the sole of one of his feet, leaving raw nerves, so his language got even worse than normal. He was at Millfield. And then he basically got hemorrhoids, and his language got even worse. Then one day he fell over and cracked his head open on a rock, and his eyes filled up with blood, and he started to whinge. He basically suggested that we ought to rest for a couple of days. At that point, if we had rested at all, we had the wrong clothing, the dark cold was coming, we had to keep going. Amazing guy, Charlie. He's sadly dead now, but he was a wonderful bloke. I've got a picture of his better foot. We made it 400 miles. Ginny had got there 3 months earlier in summer in the ski plane, dug all the ice out of 2 abandoned huts on the edge of the world by scientists, and that's where we lived for 8 months, the 3 of us. And eventually the sun came back, and about a month before it did, Charlie and I said goodbye to Ginny, set out in the dark. A week later, she looked out of the living hut at the stores hut, where everything we stored, the parachutes we would need for the 8-month attempt to cross the top, it had caught fire. She tried to put it out, but did a bad job. She sent a Morse code message. We were 200 miles away in the dark by then. All the pictures I took of that in the dark for the first month came out sort of black, so there's no point showing them to you. But if you can imagine, that's what it did look like when the sun did come up. You've got steam from open water at -50, even though water freezes at -2, because of the movement of the current. The noise is huge out there in the dark. We eventually got to the North Pole, at which point humans, for the first time in history, had reached both poles. We put a flag there because people do, but it's pretty stupid because within half an hour that flag will be a mile away from the pole because the ice is floating. If you go there later and you want to put your flag there, drill a hole in the ice, swim down 17,000 feet to the seabed, put your flag there and it will stay put. We did not do that. At that point, we wanted to go due south for 1,800 miles to where the ship might rescue us eventually. But unfortunately, today people go to the North Pole, a helicopter will remove them before the breakup. What is the breakup? Ultraviolet rays in summer weaken the ice. You get a storm 200 miles away. Ice grows 3 feet a year on the sea, and where the old multi-year ice flows are, which are much deeper, they are where the current is stronger, and they go like battering rams hundreds of miles, breaking up all the ice that you are sitting on, and you can hear the roar of approaching breakup from 100 miles. Not good for people with imagination. That's why we have ex-military people. We wanted to go due south because that's where Greenwich was, on the compass, which is the only means of navigation. Unfortunately, every single potential destination in the world was also due south on the compass. And this caused a big bad argument between the two of us at that point. After 500 miles, we could no longer travel, everything was breaking up, so we found an ice floe 8 foot deep on the drill and started to float towards Siberia. We floated for weeks and months. We sat in the tent. Every time it broke, we moved the tent somewhere else. We never got bored because Charlie on the left had a solar panel which gave us enough power to listen to the BBC World Service for 2 minutes a day, if there was reception. And I can remember one particular day, Charlie, with his headsets on, said, "The United Kingdom is at war." So I said, "Who with?" And he said, "Oh, I didn't get that bit." We sat for 5 days of bad radio reception arguing who the hell we could be at war with. Obviously, we assumed it was France, but we had no proof. When they said it was Argentina, we thought that was just a stupid BBC joke. We also did not get bored because we got visited 600 miles from anybody. They weigh 1 ton. You hear them sniffing outside the tent door. One of you goes out with a Nikon camera, the other one with a .44 Magnum revolver. They weigh 1 ton, and basically the Canadians had assured us that only 10% actually eat humans. But when they're just outside the tent, you can't really ask them which percentage. Our main worry was not the bears. Our home, as it by then was after 3 months that we were floating on, is tiny. The ice and sea were coming over it. We were getting very desperate. We sent a Morse code message to Southampton to come early, but they tried too early and hit hard ice and began to sink. Cleverly, they rammed ice floes so that the damage was up in the air and basically managed to survive and got down to Spitsbergen and Svalbard for proper repairs. Out on the ice, we were really panicking. We had made a canoe with skis, but when we actually happened, we didn't dare go in the canoe. We were too weak by then, and the ice moved much quicker than we could. We'd get crushed. We were very lucky. The ship tried again and got stuck 18 miles from our ice floe. You'll think 18 miles, what's that? But it was the most difficult bit of all. Everything's moving. You can't see 30-foot ice walls and so on. But we did get on board. If you look carefully, you should be able to see us on the ice there, just next to the ship. When we arrived on board the ship, human beings, for the first and last time in history, had been around our Earth vertically. Nobody's done it before or since. There have been more people on the moon. We arrived back at Greenwich. There's the patron, Prince Charles. He's been a very good patron for 38 years. We arrived back there within 2 days of the date, planned 9.5 years previously on Ginny's little map. We kept our team together in the 80s and the 90s. We used British aerospace technology in order to be able to go over Nylas, which is ½ an inch thick. If you went over there, you would go through, it would go over your head at 3 miles an hour, and that would be that. We also had space technology so that we did not have to have heavy amphibious gear crossing newly forming Sugar, which had never been done before. You don't even have a toothbrush because for 3 months it isn't vital to your survival. Weight is everything. You take all the wrappers off the chocolate and everything. So you certainly don't want heavy amphibious gear. We also used political lateral thought. If you look very carefully at the top of that globe, you'll see a little white dot very near the edge of the picture. That was the North Pole. 500 miles south, the coast of Siberia. About 1992, Gorbachev announced perestroika, so I wrote a letter, "Dear Mr. Gorbachev, can I lead the first Western expedition from Siberia?" He basically said yes, but the trouble is the only place you can set out from, Artachisky, was also a secret Soviet missile base. So I had to sign a contract that while there I would take no photos. I did not, the other members of the team did. When we got back to the UK after breaking the world record for the next 9 years, we discovered that this time it wasn't our main rivals, the Norwegians, it was NASA in Pasadena, California. What they do at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory is they put special cameras on the shuttle, they fly up to 170 kilometers in space, and they take photographs of whatever they want. In this case, the lost city, Arabia. They were looking for the city. I'd been looking for it for 25 years by then. I was about to find it, and it was extremely annoying having NASA getting in on the act. with things I didn't have access to. That is a NASA professor. Each brown line is a big sand dune. In between each of those brown lines is 80 miles. Up to the top is Saudi Arabia. Down where it's blue is the Indian Ocean. Well, way into the sand dunes, they knew that there was the lost city in an exact place, and they knew it because even though it was 10 meters under the sand, they could somehow see the outline. It's called cheating. And they knew it was the lost city because it was right angles, and only people make things with right angles, so it must be the lost city. Well, we in London got very annoyed. We managed to get Land Rover to quickly give us special Land Rovers, and 4 months before NASA were able to mount their own expedition to their position, we got out to it, and it's called the L site. My archaeologist, Dr. Yuri Zarins, the best in the world, took one look at the NASA site, and he said, actually, this is not the lost city. This is a place made by God using right angles in order to fool NASA. So we reverted to traditional archaeology, and on the 23rd of November, we found the lost city, 26 years after Ginny and I started looking for it. Frustrating for me, because the place that we found it was 500 meters away from the base camp I had always used for 26 years. I'm just going to end up with one more expedition. That white blob is Antarctica. That was drawn by the hand of an Irish guy called Shackleton in 1906. That's what people, 20th century, thought Antarctica looked like. You can see the tip of South America. You see a black line. That's the ship which Shackleton planned to take from South America. It would land him on the coastline of Antarctica. He and 3 friends would then try to walk all the way to the South Pole, which is where there's a bit of writing in the middle. If they got there, they knew they would die of hunger because you can't carry enough food. If you look at the bottom of the picture from Australia, there's another black line. That was Shackleton's other half of his expedition. Their plan was to land and drop food off between them and the pole so that Shackleton would have something to eat as he came out. What actually happened was Shackleton's ship sunk, so he never did set out, but he couldn't tell the other lot, so they did set out, and they tried to drop food off, but they were killed and didn't drop it off, so if Shackleton had made it to the pole, he would have died anyway. But it was a good plan. It was copied about 40 years later using those vehicles. A pincer move, like Shackleton, 2 different expeditions to the pole, met there and managed to get out. That's a typical Antarctic crevasse. So by the 90s, when I'm talking about, the only people that had ever crossed Antarctica, the blue line from north to south, that was my wife Ginny's round the world expedition. The red one, American Steger in 1990. The diagonal, Hillary and Fuchs, Hillary the first guy up Everest, and that was money by New Zealand and British government. And then the little yellow line you may not be able to see was man-hauling by the world's greatest climber, Reinhold Messner, and Germany's top polar man. All 4 of us used air support. Now in the 90s, when I'm talking about 1902, in the UK, we heard that our main rivals in Norway were about to try the big one in the polar field, the first ever crossing of the entire continent with nothing except what you carry on your back or your sledge on day 1. That's 500 pounds for 1,800 miles with no support. We knew it couldn't be done. You would die of hunger before you got there. But if your main rivals are out there, you can't give them a clean start. So we quickly put a team together. We managed to catch the only aeroplane to Antarctica's biggest airport. You can see the control tower. It's a round thing on the left-hand side. We changed aircraft. We flew 1,200 miles to the start point on the edge of Antarctica. That is where the frozen sea hits Antarctica. On the same day that we got dropped off by a ski plane there, so did the Norwegians 100 miles away. Our team consisted of myself and the guy in blue, Dr. Michael Stroud, who is Europe's top physiologist. He specializes in studying advanced starvation on humans, so he was in his element on this expedition. What he studies is when you starve and you have no more body fat, you start cannibalizing your muscle. It's not known about whether you go for your heart muscle, which is stupid, or your thigh muscle, which is not. That is what he was studying on this expedition. He monitored our daily output at 8,500 calories each per day. You only use 2,000 if you're running a marathon. Some days we used 11,500 calories. We could only eat 5,000 because that's what we could carry. I set out at 15.5 stone. By the halfway point, I was under 9 stone. Despite eating 5,000 calories a day, we were totally skeletal. Even Weight Watchers would not recommend this. You can't wear Gore-Tex. Towing 500 pounds, you sweat even at -50, and then as soon as you stop work, you're getting hypothermia. So you have to have cotton, which is 100% breathable. You can't wear your normal soft boots to protect your toes. You just won't move 500 pounds, it'll stay there. So you wear deep, rigid plastic boots which dig the skins on the skis in, then you can move your sledge forward, but it really damages your toes. That is after 10 days. It's very painful for the first hour. Then they get cold and stop hurting. That's gangrene after 3 weeks. After 3 months, we knew that we would have skin grafts. Australia, Sydney, ozone hole, skin cancer. Much worse out here because you're under the hole, you must cover your skin. But remember, you can't cover your mouth because you are towing 500 pounds on a dog harness on your ribs. You're breathing like hell. Every time you can't put something over your mouth. So therefore, you just have lips which get the sun off the ice. They get scabby. In the tent at night, all these scabs stick together when you sleep. In the morning, when you wake up, you must say good morning to the other man. It's called team dynamics. But you cannot open your mouth until you've pulled the lips apart. The first thing you do in the morning is eat porridge out of a communal bowl. So all your blood goes in his porridge, which causes bad relations. You don't need to pass maths to work out right now what time it is on that man's watch. Bearing in mind the sun is due north at midday, he's treading on his shadow, he wants to go to the South Pole, so it must be midday on his watch. That was the most sophisticated method of navigating for 1,800 miles without any features until '94 when polar satellites arrived down there with GPS. I took that photograph of a crevasse because I could see it. Normally you can't see anything at all. That's why I developed a very careful policy, which was to watch the bloke ahead. Nobody's going to fall into that one. I mean, you can see a person up in the hole at the top of that one. You'd be pretty stupid. We reached the South Pole, at which point the Norwegians dropped out pretty much dead. We were in a very, very bad way, and the only way we carried on to do the other half of the expedition was because Dr. Stroud had a contract with the Lancet medical magazine on the topic of advanced starvation. And at the pole, he weighed us and found that we were starving even more than he had hoped. And he was determined to complete the article, even if it was posthumous, so we carried on. We did the first ever descent of the Beardmore Glacier 9,000 feet without crampons, because we'd lost them. I began to hate him. I've done another 25 years of expeditions with Mike, but back then, every 5 days he took your blood, didn't have much blood left for science. Every 8 days, he made you drink a container of liquid costing $1,000. And for 24 hours after you drink it, any liquid coming out of your body has to be collected in bottles, particularly urine. Now, to fill a pee bottle outside at an average of -90 centigrade is dangerous for that part of your body if you are male. Although, obviously, at that temperature, the difference between males and females is not great. His hands got very bad. The blisters burst. I don't know if you can see the end of one of his fingers, totally raw. By day 80, 7 of his fingers were raw right the way down to the hand, but he's still keeping all his meticulous notes. That was my hand. I had a slight problem. I made a mistake for about 3 minutes, as a result of which 5 months later, I had the top half of all the fingers on that hand amputated. You don't want to make mistakes in those conditions. We reached the far side of Antarctica, pretty much dead, but we got there, at which point humans, for the first time in history, had crossed the entire continent with no outside support, which today remains the longest unsupported polar journey in history. When we got back to the UK, in laboratories, we had 19 deep muscle biosections, removing spaghetti-like muscle without any anesthetic. I enjoyed taking that photograph of Mike. I think from all the expeditions, We have raised a total of £16.3 million. We've started Britain's first MS research centre. All the expeditions have a charity and a science programme, but from my point of view, that's not really it. As I said, it is the profession that I chose from school, and I know that to keep getting sponsorship, we need to retain our leadership at all times over our known rivals. Thank you.